Well, it is a treat to be here. And I got to tell you, despite appearances to the contrary, something unexpected is happening in 2025. Belief in God and the supernatural appear to be making a comeback. Now, if that were true, why would that be unexpected? Let me take you back to the middle of the 20th century and paint a larger story of where we've been. In 1966, Time magazine had an iconic magazine that came out with a cover that asked the question, "Is God dead?" Coming out of World War II, there was a band of theologians called the God is Dead movement, in a sense, the death of God movement. Fast forward to the early 2000s, for a decade, conversations about God were dominated by this group called the New Atheists. Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who not only said that God was dead, but the world is and will be much better if we can get rid of belief in God. Christopher Hitchens wrote this in his book, God is Not Great. Religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Maybe you've heard since the 1990s, which, by the way, is the second greatest decade after the 80s, but I digress. There was a rise in what's called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning people who do not identify as a particular religion. So if you go back to the early 90s, over 90% of Americans identified as Christians. Now in the latest Pew poll, it's 62%. You start to consider these factors, and one would seemingly be justified in concluding that God is out of a job. But I'm not sure this is the whole story. I think God is making a comeback, so to speak, in our cultural moment. For one reason, the God conversation is shifting. What I mean by this is the days of the new atheists railing against God are gone, for the most part. Now we have a generation of influencers saying bold things like, actually, we kind of need Jesus as a culture. Jordan Peterson, for example, a mega influencer, Canadian psychologist, in his book, We Who Wrestle with God, he called Christianity the story on which Western civilization is predicated. He called the Bible that. And he said, science, it was basically Christianity that was the impetus for science. You could consider other thinkers like Barry Weiss, Jonathan Rauch, who, by the way, is a gay atheist Jew who said in the New York Times about 2 months ago, America needs Jesus. Joe Rogan saying things like religion is good for America. The conversation has shifted. But second, we've also seen some high-profile conversions, totally unexpected a few years ago. So some of you might recognize the name Ayaan Hirsi Ali, mega best-selling author. She grew up in a fundamentalist Muslim home, shifted and became one of the outspoken new atheists. And then in November 2023, she wrote an article about why she now believes in God. And she said, there's a better way to manage the challenges of existence than either Islam or unbelief had to offer. And she has a story that's coming public soon about a miraculous experience, in a sense, and transformation in her life because of believing in Jesus. That's just one example. Third, I think there's a growing awareness of the failure of secularism. What I mean by this, take, for example, Ross Douthat is one of the only conservative columnists at the New York Times. And Ross Douthat, when he started, kind of in the heyday of the New Atheists, maybe 15 years ago, he said the conversation about God has now shifted. What was antagonistic, now people are open and interested in spiritual things. He wrote a book that just came out this February called Believe, and he said mystery and magic and enchantment seem to be rushing back into the world. There's an Orthodox writer by the name of Rod Dreher, a New York Times bestselling writer. He wrote a book called Living in Wonder. And he makes the case that this new fascination with UFOs and psychedelics in our culture is kind of signifying this deeper spiritual yearning that people have. Fourth piece, interesting, is that Bible sales are up 22% in 2024. Now, I don't want to read too much into that last point. Trends can come and trends can go. But I have a podcast. I teach at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University in Southern California. And thank you, 2 people appreciate that. And we have a weekly podcast that I co-host. And every Friday we have like this weekly cultural update. So I'm always trying to gauge what's happening in the news. And a couple stories that have hit recently. One, about 2 weeks ago, Vanity Fair had a whole story, and then in the Atlantic, about how God is back in Silicon Valley. 10, 15 years ago, believing in God was like it wasn't an asset to you, it worked against you. Now there's more and more talk and openness to God in Silicon Valley, interestingly enough. I got an email this morning from one of the leading demographers, and he actually said belief in the afterlife is slightly rising in America. Friends, the conversation has shifted, and there seems to be an openness to God that there wasn't 5, 10, 20 years ago. Now, none of this should surprise us. I'm going to argue in a minute that not only there's an openness to God, but I think the evidence points towards the existence of God. Going back to the middle of the 20th century, when Time magazine asked the question, is God dead? I think the evidence was just emerging at that time, pointing the opposite direction. But none of this should surprise us because 3,000 years ago, David said this. He said, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. So if I may, I'm going to lay out for us 7 reasons God is back. Number 1, the discovery of the beginning of the universe. Now, why is that significant? There's an old joke of some scientists who come to God and say, God, we can do everything that you can do. And God says, okay, like what? They said, we can make human beings. God says, okay, show me. So they reach down, they pick up some dust, and God says, wait a minute, get your own dust. Where did the dust come from? Stars? Where did the stars come from? Quantum fluctuations? Where did they come from? Friends, if something exists, it begs the question, where did that come from and why does it exist? We need some ultimate explanation that itself is uncaused to account for why anything exists at all. Now, for 50 years, by the way, 5 decades, this man by the name of Antony Flew was one of the most outspoken and influential atheists on the planet. He basically set the agenda for atheism the last half of the 20th century. He presented a paper before the Socratic Club, which was chaired by C.S. Lewis at Oxford in the 50s, arguing that the idea of God was just meaningless and not justified. Well, he died in 2010. But in 2007, he wrote a book that, let's just say, was mildly provocative called There Is a God. How the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. Now, he walks through how the science had shifted in the time that he started towards the end of the 20th century into the 21st century. But one point he writes is this. He said, when I first met the Big Bang Theory as an atheist, it seemed to me the theory made a big difference because it suggested that the universe had a beginning and that the first sentence in Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, was related to an event in the universe. As long as the universe could be comfortably thought to be not only without end, but also without beginning, it remained easy to see its existence as brute facts. If there had been no reason to think the universe had a beginning, there'd be no reason to postulate something else that produced the whole thing. But the Big Bang Theory changed that. If the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning, and I think he's right. So this is sometimes called the cosmological argument. It sounds fancy, but it's actually simple. Two premises and a conclusion. I've been on a plane with people, and they say, oh, why do you believe in God? I say, well, let me pull out a napkin and tell you why. Premise number one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now stop and think about that. First off, that's common sense, isn't it? You don't get something from nothing. Things don't begin to exist spontaneously without a sufficient reason that they're beginning to exist. We don't empirically see this happening, and it's common sense. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second, the universe began to exist. Now, there's a range of scientific evidence, like the law of thermodynamics, that says things move from hot to cold. If you look in the universe, there's disequilibrium. So if we've been here forever, the energy would have run down in the universe, but it hasn't, tells us the universe is not eternal. That's one reason, amongst others, that tells us the universe began to exist. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then therefore what? The universe has a cause. Exactly. Now, the only way to challenge this is to challenge premise one or challenge premise two. Either believe that something can come from nothing, or reject the strong scientific evidence that the universe itself had a beginning. Now, what must this cause be like? Well, if the universe began to exist, it must be spaceless and timeless and powerful and at least really smart and arguably personal. This sounds a lot like God. So I'd argue the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. The second piece of evidence that God is back is the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, what do I mean by this? I want to imagine you come visit me in Southern California, and I live in a town called San Juan Capistrano, about an hour south of LA, hour north of San Diego, kind of by the coast, and there's some undeveloped land, not like here, of course, but some undeveloped land, and we go exploring, and we come across this cabin. You're like, let's take a look. When you come walking up, you notice something strange. You hear the sound of your favorite song in the background, Beat It by Michael Jackson. You ignore the obvious warning and decide to go in, but you notice something even more strange. Shoes lined up just your size, a jacket that fits you perfectly. You look on the table, and it's all the books you like to read. There's a small fridge you open up, the exact snacks you like to munch on, a small bathroom, and the precise toiletries that you use. Now, what would you suspect? Well, besides thinking you might be in a horror movie, you would, at some point, you'd stop saying coincidence, coincidence, coincidence. You'd say, you know what? Too many things are lined up precisely for me. Someone must have known that I was coming. Friends, in many ways, this mirrors our universe as a whole. There are certain constants in physics and cosmology that you might say govern our universe, a range of laws, and they all have one strange thing in common. They're set precisely where they need to be to have a universe even capable of supporting life. Physicist Freeman Dyson said, as we look out in the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. It's like the laws of physics are like Goldilocks. That's too hot, that's too cold, just right. As if they exist on a razor's edge, and the slightest move to the left or the right and the entire universe becomes inhospitable for life. Now, scientists have found dozens of these. But what happens if we mathematically take just two of them to be set at the precise parameter they need to be set at, again, to have a universe capable of supporting life? Well, if we take what's called gravity, which has to be fine-tuned 1 times 10 with 40 zeros after it, cosmological constant 1 times 10 with 53 zeros after it, what are odds that these two of a few dozen laws are set where they need to be to allow life? Well, the number comes to 100 million trillion, 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 trillion. That's a big number. In case you can't grasp it, just think of our new national debt. That was like a painful laughter, wasn't it? The odds of this happening by chance are virtually nil. I think the fine-tuning points towards a cosmic fine-tuner. Third evidence God is back is the origin of life. The origin of life. Now, if you go back to scientists in the 1800s around the time of Darwin, they thought, because of the technology they had at the time, that there must be a simple explanation for the origin of life. Well, Anthony Flew asked the right question. He says, how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? That's such a good question. How do you get life from non-life? How do you get living things from chemistry, physical cells? I mean, you don't have cells are alive, physical matter, and the laws of nature. How does this happen? Well, to put it into context, a typical human body, the average human body, honestly, I'm 155.9, so I'm probably about as average as you'll find. My body would have roughly 30 trillion cells in it. 30 trillion cells. Now, if you take the DNA out of each cell in your body, it uncoils to about 6 feet in length, 2 meters. That means all the DNA in the average body, when strung together, would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. Wow is exactly right. Now, according to one estimate, each cell has the equivalent of about 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. And this is why Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Now, this raises a thorny question, doesn't it? If we have so much information, so sophisticated, beyond human technology, then what can sufficiently account for its origin? Well, any honest scientist will tell you they don't have a clue how life can come from life naturalistically. But one thing we do know is whenever we have information and we trace it back to its source, we find an intelligent source. So Stephen Meyer, a Cambridge-trained philosopher of science, said whenever we find specified information, we know the causal story of how that information arose. We always find that it arose from an intelligent source. So if you get a text and it's legible, you trace it back to a texter. Read a blog, back to a blog. A book, back to an author. If you have a shirt with words on it, you trace it back to the maker of the shirt. If I walk outside and the clouds say, drink Coke, none of you'd say, yep, that happens here, Sean, in North Idaho when a storm is coming down from Canada. None of you would say that. If it says drink Coke, we know minimally there was a pilot who wrote that, not the laws of physics. When you look inside the human body, you find more information than any book or many books, and certainly drink Coke. I would argue the information in the cell points towards an information giver, a mind. Fourth evidence God is back is the origin and nature of consciousness. Some time ago, I invited on a young thinker, African-American libertarian atheist from Colombia, interestingly enough, where there's a lot of drama in the news today. He has a podcast I really enjoy. His name is Coleman Hughes. And I invited him on my podcast. I said, you've written a book on race. Can we talk about race? And then can we just talk about God? He goes, sure. At one point, I asked him one of my favorite questions to ask non-believers. I'd invite you to write this down and steal it. You don't have to give me credit. I probably got it from somebody else. I just can't remember where I got it from. But here's the question that I love. I said to him, is there anything about the universe that gives you pause and suggests there might be a God? Isn't that an interesting question? Ask a non-believer that. Is there anything about the world that gives you pause and makes you think there might be the supernatural? There might be life after death. Jesus might be God. God might be real. And one thing he said to me, he goes, Sean, consciousness is a mystery. How do you get from matter in motion, conscious, let alone self-conscious conscious beings. He was like, atheism has no explanation for this. And he's exactly right. Now, if you go back to the 19th and 20th centuries, in professional philosophy, the idea that humans were body and soul was considered ridiculous. Materialism dominated. The soul is a myth, you're just a body. It was ridiculed in professional philosophy. But a colleague of mine at Talbot by the name of J.P. Moreland is one of the most influential and brilliant living philosophers. And he just came out with a book. If you want to study the soul and see the evidence for it, this is your book. He said, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, things are changing. We're witnessing a resurgence of substance dualism, which is basically the idea that humans are body and soul, undergoing an unforeseen revival. I think he's right. So about 3 months ago, I invited on a well-known skeptic. He's a PhD, New York Times bestselling author. Some of you might recognize the name Michael Shermer. Really fun guy, thoughtful. I said, hey, we come on my show for an hour and debate morality and consciousness. And we debated for 2 hours. And at one point towards the end, I pressed him to explain the origin of free will, because you can't have morality without free will, right? If I say you should do this, that implies you have the capacity to do it or not do it. But you can't have free will without consciousness. So I said, how do you get consciousness from matter? What's your atheist explanation for consciousness? And while there's different answers, he said something effective. At a certain level of complexity, consciousness just emerges, which to me is the ultimate non-explanation. I think it's basically magic. Now, he gave the example. He said, for example, inflation. In certain economies, inflation just appears, but no direct cause. And I remember thinking, inflation is an effect. It's not a cause. Inflation in a system in which you have intelligent agents acting is totally different than matter magically spawning self-consciousness. Friends, naturalism cannot explain the origin of consciousness. But if God is a conscious being, then it makes perfect sense that he can and would create beings who are conscious. Human consciousness points to a cosmic consciousness. Fifth evidence is the moral law. The moral law. Now, 15 years ago, I had my first public debate with a high school teacher in my town who was a PhD. I had not started my PhD yet. I was teaching at a private school. He was a mile or two, maybe 2 miles away in my same town at the public school. And I got a notification to see if I would debate him on something related to morality or God at the local JC. I said, sure. Now, we landed on the question, is God the best explanation for morality? And so I did a ton of work. I was prepping for this, and about 2 weeks before the debate, I heard him on a podcast. He said something effective. I'm debating this guy, Sean McDonald, and I'm thinking, he can't even get my name right, on whether or not you have to believe in God to be moral. The moment I heard that, I thought, oh, he doesn't even understand the nature of the debate. The question is not, you have to believe in God to be moral. Believing in God is irrelevant to whether you can choose right or wrong. Believing in God is irrelevant to knowing that there's right and wrong. Why? Because even people who don't believe in God still live in the world that God has made, and according to Romans 2, have a conscience written on their hearts with awareness that there's right and wrong. See, friends, think about it this way. You can read a blog if you don't believe in bloggers. You can still read it. But you can't have blogs without bloggers. The question is, where does right and wrong come from? Is right and wrong real in a universe in which there's no God? So this is really what's called the moral argument. Again, it's simple. It's simple. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. In other words, if there is no God, there's no such thing as real right and wrong and real human value. We might believe in these things, but they've just been wired into us by evolution, and they're illusions to get us to survive. So if God doesn't exist, objective moral values and duties are a myth. Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, said, if God does not exist, all is permissible. So for there to be a moral law, there needs to be a moral law giver. So if there's no moral law giver, there's no objective moral law. Well, the second premise is objective moral values and duties do exist. The question is, how do we know? You say, Sean, how do you really know that right and wrong exists and there's objective moral values and duties? Well, one of my colleagues at Talbot and mentors, some of you might recognize the name William Lane Craig, another leading philosopher today. He said, if somebody doesn't think torturing a baby for fun is wrong, this person doesn't need an argument. They need a therapist. And he's right. Some things in life are obvious and self-evident. In fact, the Declaration of Independence says we hold these truths to be what? Self-evident. That all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, you might say, well, yeah, our framers didn't exactly live that out, and you're right. And we can only say they were hypocritical if there's a standard of morality by which we can judge them as actually doing wrong. Which makes the point that we all know there's right and wrong. In fact, the professor I debated that I showed earlier, one of the coolest things I did when I taught high school full-time is 3 of my high school students decided to challenge 3 of these atheist students to a debate at our Christian school. And we packed out our church, not this big, maybe like a half to a third. There's maybe 400 people there. We debated intelligent design, evolution, debated historical Jesus, and morality. And one of their students made the point. He said, or actually, let me take a step back. My students started by saying, we know there's right and wrong. We expect people to tell the truth. There's a moral law because there's a moral law giver. One of their students came up and said, there's no objective moral law. It's all subjective like ice cream flavor. There's no right and wrong. But then it came to the concluding statements. And the student who just said there's no right and wrong came behind the podium, looked out and noticed he had a mainly Christian audience. He said, you know what? You guys are all bigots. You're hateful. You're intolerant. Shame on you. Repeated himself, and he sat down. Do you notice anything odd? There's no right and wrong. It's all subjective. But you bigoted, immoral Christians have violated every objective moral norm, and you should have acted differently. Why did he do that? Because his worldview said there's no right and wrong, but he couldn't escape it. We know there's right and wrong. I tell my students in California, I say, look, if somebody tells you there's no such thing as right and wrong, cut in front of them in line. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Friends, the moral law points to a moral law giver. 6th reason is modern day miracles. Modern day miracles. Now, in 2010, one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world, Craig Keener, you actually saw him interviewed in Show Me Your Glory. It's an incredible film. I hope you will go see it. I got to be interviewed for it. I saw an early one, and we showed it at our church I think it was last Friday. I can't remember. It's all blending together. It was last Friday. And I sat there in tears. I was so moved by the stories. Keener was interviewed in that. Why? Because in 2010, he wrote a 2-volume, careful academic look at miracle claims in the world today. The most in-depth, careful analysis I'm aware of. And he said this. He said, in different countries around the world and in different denominations, the blind receive sight, the deaf hear, people healed from HIV, encounters with the demonic, even raisings from the dead. He said, the kind of miracle claims frequently attested in the Gospels and Acts are also attested by many eyewitnesses today. That doesn't mean God answers all our prayers or necessarily most of our prayers, for reasons we could come to in the Q&A if that's important to you. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we have hundreds of millions of people alive today who believe they've seen or experienced the miraculous. He did an update to this book in 2021 called Miracles Today. In fact, he even carefully documents some miracles that are arguably caught on video camera. Now, don't go to YouTube and search miracles caught on video camera. It'll probably be generated by AI. But if you're a skeptic, great. Pick up his book, read it with an open mind, track down some of the sources. I find it quite compelling. But I'm going to ask you a question in just a minute here. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, not yet. And here's what the question is going to be. If you believe you have seen with your own eyes or personally experienced something that can only be explained by a miracle, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to raise your hands, not yet. Now, here's what I don't mean by a miracle. I don't mean it was Christmas 3 or 4 months ago and you're like, I didn't get my mother-in-law a gift. God, I really need that parking spot and this perfect gift, and God delivers. Now, God can do that. I think he cares about the small things. But if you're a skeptic, could you at least see why that might not be compelling? I mean something in your life of its nature and the timing that could not be explained naturally, and the best explanation is supernatural. So if you believe you have seen with your own eyes or personally experienced a miracle of that kind, right now, will you raise your hands? Put your hands up. Hold them up there for a minute. Keep them up and look around. Look around. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe half, maybe 40%. You can put them down. Now, if I went around and ruled out in fact, let's do this. Put your hands back up. I've never done this. Put them back up. I want only those born in December to keep your hands up. We still have about 40 or 50 hands up. Now you put your hands down. In other words, hundreds of millions of Christians worldwide believe they've seen a miracle. If you rule out over 90% of them, you still have a few million people who believe they've seen and experienced the miraculous. Now, I wish we had a mic and we could go around the room and hear some of your stories. That would be powerful. The only reason I hesitate is there's always that one guy. And if you don't think you're that one guy, that's because you are. So when we come to the Q&A, maybe filter it through somebody before you take the mic, but I digress. I think modern-day miracles point to the existence of a miracle worker. And finally, up to the very week that we are in right now, I think the seventh evidence God is back is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. I think from the first century, there's been eyewitness testimony pointing towards the power of the resurrection. I am an apologist. I teach in a master's program, and I can tell you, we live in an age right now where we have more access to evidence pointing towards the resurrection than we have ever had in the history of the church. Now, there's more skeptics and there's more challenges, but there's more evidence. One example would be a friend of mine. If you study this, you might recognize the name Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas grew up in a Christian home, but in high school, he started having doubts. So in high school, probably in the 60s, he started keeping these note cards like you would keep at a library, laying out like, how do we know the witnesses are reliable? Maybe they had an hallucination. Maybe Jesus died on the cross. And he just started charting every conceivable thing. He needed to know if this was true. Did his senior high school paper on the resurrection. Fell into a season of doubt, and then ended up in 1976 graduating from Michigan State University, earning his PhD, writing his thesis on the resurrection of Jesus, a rational inquiry. Now, if you're going to graduate from Michigan State and have people on your committee that are not Christians, you need to minimally make a case that meets historical standards of those who might not even believe in God. But then he went into another 10-year period of serious doubt. He told me he almost considered becoming a Buddhist. And this made him go back and study even more than he ever had before. Well, about a year ago, he published volume 1 of a 4-volume set defending the resurrection. The first volume you see up there is 1,100 pages over 5 pounds. I bought 2 just to work out with it. Volume 1 lays out the evidence. Volume 2, he responds to naturalistic hypotheses. Volume 3 comes out next month in May. Volume 4 comes out, I think, next fall. I'm not saying he's right because he's written a big book. That would be dumb. But I think he's researched this more than anybody probably ever has examined the resurrection. And what scholars have concluded, interestingly enough, is there are certain facts about Jesus that virtually all scholars accept because the evidence is so strong pointing towards them. So, for example, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Friends, the evidence Jesus died by crucifixion is basically overwhelming. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have Paul's writings, other New Testament writings. We have early church fathers talking about this. We have Josephus, a Jew in the 90s, and Tacitus, a Roman in AD 115. And besides, if you're going to invent a death for your founder, the last death on the face of the planet you would invent is the most shameless, humiliating death of crucifixion. Deuteronomy says if you're hung on a tree, you're cursed. So why would they invent that? The answer is they didn't. Jesus was crucified. But second, the disciples report experiences with Jesus they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. So the vast majority of scholars would say the disciples report that they believed they had seen the risen Jesus after his death. Again, why? We have multiple appearance accounts in the New Testament, the Gospels. We have Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 saying he appears to the 500, he appears to the 12. We have the early church fathers. We have the book of Acts. It's just too strong, the evidence, to deny the disciples at least report that they believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Third, Saul became a follower of Jesus after having an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. The vast majority of scholars, and these aren't like evangelical Christian scholars that teach at Biola with me. These are like many to the left who don't even believe in God, or liberal Christianity and everywhere in between. So why is this important? If you come up with some theory to explain the belief of the disciples, you got to come up with another theory to explain the conversion of Paul, who was persecuting the Christians. Do you see how this becomes a little trickier? Not to mention James, a brother of Jesus who didn't believe in him during his lifetime. And fourth, the tomb of Jesus was found empty shortly after his death. About 80% of scholars accept this. Now, Habermas gives about 24 arguments for the empty tomb. I won't even begin to walk into all of them, but one fascinating is all Gospels report that the tomb was discovered by who? By women. You know why that matters? In that culture, a woman's testimony was considered far less significant than a man's. Patriarchal culture. So if you're inventing a story where you need a resurrection, and to get a resurrection, you need an empty tomb, and for people to believe in it, they need reliable witnesses, who's the least likely witnesses they would invent? The women. Why did the story say that? Because the disciples believed this is actually what happened. Now, there's a bunch of naturalistic hypotheses for this. Some would say maybe Jesus didn't really die on the cross. Maybe they hallucinated. The problem is none of these hypotheses can explain all the facts. If they hallucinated, you still need to explain Saul, and the body would still be in the tomb. If he didn't really die on the cross, what explains the apostles' belief that he died on the cross, and again, Paul? I think the resurrection confirms Jesus as God's unique revelation in history. That God is real, he's taken on human flesh, and he paid the ultimate price to be in relationship with us. If we're simply humble enough to confess our sins and believe in Jesus, he says eternal life begins today. You know the irony? Tomorrow is what Friday? Good Friday. I mean, you ever just thought for a moment how weird it is that we call it Good Friday? I mean, what happened on Good Friday? Our Savior was humiliated and whipped and mocked, treated like a criminal, and publicly crucified as an enemy of Rome. We don't call it Good Friday the day that JFK was shot or Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. That would actually be really messed up. We call it Good Friday because Jesus said on the cross, "It is finished." And even though Pilate thought, and the religious leaders thought, that death surely would put an end to him. If there's anything that's permanent that ends your story, it's death. And so Pilate says to Jesus in John chapter 19, "You won't speak to me? Don't you know I have authority over you, whether you get crucified or not?" And Jesus says, "You have no authority over me, except the authority that comes from above. I lay down my life and I pick it up again." It's Good Friday because sin was paid for, but Sunday is coming and the tomb was empty. From the beginning and fine-tuning of the universe, to the origin of life and consciousness, to the existence of the moral law, from modern-day miracles to the historical evidence Jesus has risen, God is back, friends. He's back. Now, I realize I didn't talk about, say, the problem of evil. That's a big question we have to be willing to address. I realize I spent 5 minutes on each of these arguments. In my program, we spend semesters on some of these. But I think it's at least sufficient to say, going back to the 20th century, proclamations that God is dead, or the new atheist that said God is out of a job, could not have been more wrong. The evidence points towards God, and it also seems in our culture there's a slight awakening to the supernatural. You might say Aslan is on the move. Well, friends, we're going to make sure we have a time of Q&A. So I'm going to ask Chris to come on out here, if you will. And we have a system set up. You can probably, thank you. I appreciate that. We have a system set up, so we're going to have 2 mics out here for you to come up. You can ask at a mic, and you noticed how earlier I kind of set you up to not be that guy. That was intentional. But you are welcome to come up towards the mics. We also have a system where you can text in questions. And for the next chunk of time, we're going to cover as many as we can. You ready to go?
I'm excited. I'm not the one who has to answer them. Are you ready?
Good.
Hey, can we thank Sean for this time? Man, that is powerful stuff. All right, if you've got a question, come on down. We have our first taker, the brave soul.
On the left, while they're getting ready. Let's go.
You ready? All right, let's get it.
I graduated in 2005 from another Southern California Christian university. Right, Chris?
We were rivals, some would say.
We love Biola. In examining my peers in these later years after they've left a Christian university, so many of them are deconstructing their faith. Right, there's this trend to deconstruct their faith, and almost this ex-evangelical movement that's taking place. With all the evidence that you shared tonight that was taught to us in our Christian university education, What do you think is causing this trend for them to move away from the faith when we see so many non-Christians running to it?
That's a great question. So there's a proverb that says, the purposes in a man's heart are deep, and a person of wisdom draws it out. For some people, it can be intellectual. I think for most people, there are multiple things going on. It could be emotional, it could be relational, it could be spiritual. So the wise person tries to get to the root of it and, in a sense, discover what's going on. I think all this evidence does is those with eyes to see and ears to hear, it can get your attention and point towards maybe there being a God and Christianity being true. But look, evidence can't force anybody to believe. I mean, I've been reading the Gospel of John in its entirety every day, and it's been transformative to me. John chapter 11, Lazarus is dead. 4 days. Jesus raises him from the dead. He shouts, Lazarus, come out. And what happens? They all repent and follow Jesus. Nope. They want to run Jesus out of town and kill Lazarus. Poor guy already died once, right? My only point is there can be a lot of factors at play. In my experience, not always. I would venture to say probably most people, and I get serious hate for this, but I think it's true. Most people who leave the church, I'm not sure ever were really in the faith to begin with. And I've asked so many people in conversation, I mean dozens, and some I've done on air, where I've said, you've told me your story about leaving the faith. Tell me when you came in. Tell me when you knew you were a sinner and you cried out to God for his grace. Crickets. So with people like this, love on them, listen to them, be patient. They don't need somebody to preach at them, but try to have the kind of conversation to surface what's really going on and who did Jesus really claim to be? That's the root of the question.
Thank you.
Man, that's fantastic. It's really good. Just a
Bennett,
reminder,
right? Bennett, let's go.
Bennett, if you're in Hayden or watching online, you can text in your questions. We'll try to hit as many of those as we can. All right, let's hear it.
All right. My question is, when St. Thomas Aquinas writes in one of his books, some truths like the Trinity exceed the capacity for reason, but they don't contradict it. How do you explain to someone who isn't a believer, faith and reason don't contradict each other, but in fact only worked in unison?
When somebody your age quotes Thomas Aquinas, can I just tell you how much that warms my heart, for one? So in the church and outside of the church, we tend to think one of two things. Either faith is against evidence, or faith is believing something without evidence. I think the best way to counter this is to say, let's go to Scripture and let's see what model we see in Scripture about how faith and reason go together. I would say, simply put, faith is trusting in God in light of what we have reason to believe is true. Faith is not believing in spite of the evidence, it's believing in light of the evidence. I challenge you to go read Exodus 7 through 14, where Moses is showing up to the Israelites to get them to free them. Over and over again, do you know what it says? Chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. Before Moses does a miracle, he says, so that you may know. And then he does a miracle. In other words, the miracle was a sign to give them knowledge, and then they were supposed to act in faith based upon the miracle that Jesus had done. By the way, the movie Prince of Egypt actually gets it backwards. It says miracles happen when you believe. They'd still be in bondage in Egypt if they were waiting for them to believe. He did miracles not because they believed, so that they would believe. Read the Gospel of John. The whole point is Jesus did multiple signs and evidence. Water to wine, sign number 2. Healed the official's son when he's not even there at a distance, sign number 2. And at the end of the gospel, what does it say? Twice. It says there's even more miracles than we can record in this book. But why are they written down? So that you may believe. Aquinas is right. Faith goes beyond what we can understand, but it doesn't contradict it, and it's actually supported by the evidence. That's why Moses did miracles. That's why Elijah did. That's why Jesus did miracles. Good question.
Super good. We've had a couple texted in that all sort of point in the same direction.
Do it.
Essentially, from the cosmological argument, everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. A couple people have asked, why is God the exception to that? Or how would you answer the idea
Great
of
question.
where did he come from?
Okay, so God's not an exception to this. I didn't say everything that exists needs a cause. I said whatever begins to exist must have a cause. Did God begin to exist? No. If God began to exist, then God would need a cause. And we say, what caused God? Well, super God. What caused super God? Super duper God. And we keep going until we had some uncaused being that self-exists. That's what we mean by God. So, look, this is not special pleading. God, by definition, is uncaused. That's what it means to be God. Look, we can ask, where did your shoes come from? Because shoes are the kind of things that can be made. We can ask where this building came from, because buildings are the kind of things that can be made. God, by definition, can't be made. And so if you say what made God, you're literally saying what made the unmakeable creator of the universe. If you say what caused God, you're saying what caused the uncaused creator of the universe. That's as much nonsense as saying how much does the color purple weigh? It's actually a category fallacy. So God's not an exception. Pointing to God makes my point. And by the way, there's other things. If numbers exist, they didn't begin to exist. They necessarily and eternally exist. Now, I'm not going to answer whether I think numbers exist or not, but I'm saying if they do, that's the kind of thing that can be self-existent, uncaused, in the same way that God would be.
Yeah, that's great. How many of you guys have heard somebody ask a version of that question before in your life? I think that's super common, and I hope that's a good handle for you to be able to approach conversations. We'll come over here for the next one.
Hey.
Honored to meet you. My name is James. Love your stuff. A question that I've heard people pose, and I'm a believer, so it doesn't fade me, but it's like
Sure.
how to answer it is when people bring up when God tells the Israelites to drive nations out, don't leave man, woman, child, cattle, nothing, right? And there's obviously a point to that symbolically. But how do you overcome the skeptic's argument? Because really theology is really an emotional thing deep down. How do you overcome that to explain a God like that to people that don't comprehend it?
This is a great question. I'll be totally honest with you. This is one of the hardest biblical questions, period. We have full weekend seminars on this, and at the end, we're like, we just scratched the surface. So I am admittedly not even coming close to doing this justice. But here's a few things to think about. I'm a little bit perplexed why this is such a problem for the naturalistic worldview. Because if you point towards this being wrong, you're assuming some standard of right and wrong by which you're judging it, but I'm not sure where that comes from if there's not a God. Second, this assumes that human beings have value, right? I don't hear a lot of people concerned about wiping out a colony of ants. I'm sure there's some exception, but most of us are not as concerned. Well, why do human beings have value if it doesn't come from being made in the image of God? So in some ways, this question assumes a lot to the question itself that I don't think makes sense apart from a Christian worldview. Nevertheless, someone might say, well, this is just an internal problem for Christians. And I would just say a few things. I'd say, number one is we can't underestimate how profoundly evil and wicked the Canaanites and Amalekites were. Child sacrifice, sexual perversion of the kind that I won't come close to explaining. If God is God and the kind of evil that we see taking place there, then at some point God has to come in and judge. We also see in Genesis 15:16, it says to Abraham, I'm going to give you the land in 400 years. but not until the sin of the Amalekites has run its course. In other words, God is patient. He's given them chance after chance after chance to repent, and probably sending prophets telling them to do so, like he sent Jonah to Nineveh. So the level of evil, the amount of time God gave them to repent, and third still, people in those cities had heard of the God of Israel. How do I know this? Rahab, when they come and knock, she's like, I've heard the stories about you. And she was spared. So if they feared the God of Israel, they would have been spared. A lot more could be said, but that's a few things that I would bring to the table to get the conversation going.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome. All right, Quinn.
Hi, I've read your books. I really like what you do. My question is, I had a friend 2 years ago who dealt with a modern-day miracle in terms of somebody in his family passing away, but in the hospital came back. And I can say that was true because I saw some stuff that he shared with me video-wise. But I was just, from that, I kind of gotten wanting to get deeper into learning about apologetics, learning-wise. What would be good ways to get deeper into learning about that? Because I kind of am on the surface, so.
Wait, how old are you?
27.
27? Do you have an undergrad degree?
No.
Oh, shoot. I was
know.
going to say, come study apologetics with me. That
I
could
would
have
be
just
glad
fixed
to.
everything.
Yeah.
I guess I would say a couple things. I'd say you want to get certain books, you want to follow certain podcasts, you want to follow certain YouTube channels, and just start where you're at and keep going. And two things will happen, at least in most cases. Number one, you'll become more confident. But number two, you'll start having more questions you didn't even realize that you had. And that's okay. Part of faith is living with questions. Do I fully understand why God allows genocide in the Old Testament? No, sometimes it bothers me. And I feel like what Jesus, says to Peter, "You're going to leave me too?" He's like, where else would I go? Sometimes I feel that way. And so I don't know if you want me to lay out specifics. There's a lot of good books on the problem of evil. There's some really good YouTube and some podcasters that talk about this. I mean, follow William Lane Craig, follow Stand to Reason, follow J. Warner Wallace, Frank Turek, Elisa Childers. There is a wealth of good thinkers and resources today. That would be my encouragement to you. So thanks for asking that and for your heart for your friend. So
That's great. Elijah, I saw you already grabbing the mic. We'll have you go, and then we're going to get a texting question.
and we got James and Elijah. You guys have some biblical
Strong
names
Bible
here.
names.
Biblical characters tonight. My name is Elijah. Hi, Sean. Thanks for coming to our church. It's a blessing to have you here in Post Falls. And I'm going to
Thank you.
try my very best not to be that guy. With that being said, I'll ask my question. I've had many gospel apologetics conversations throughout my life, and I think the biggest thing of me being puzzled that I run into is when someone seeks the evidences. I'll have these conversations about some of these points you said or others, and they said that they genuinely seeked it out. They tried everything. They tried crying out to God, repenting of their sin. Head knowledge was everything there of there possibly being a God, but nothing happened in their heart. They couldn't feel the voice of God or have any kind of encounter with him. What would you say to these people?
So a couple things. First off, we do not understand the depths of somebody's heart. 1 Samuel 16:7, man judges by appearance, but God judges the heart. So whether or not this person is being honest and they've really thought that stuff, I don't know. I can't plumb the depths of somebody's heart. But I'm going to listen and I'm just going to ask a lot of questions. I think the way you frame that was I don't have an experience of God, and I want to say, okay, tell me what kind of experience of God you expect. Tell me about that. And oftentimes people have expectations that don't line up with reality or what Jesus said they should expect. That's my experience. So I'm going to listen, I'm going to ask questions, and just try to get to the root of it, and ultimately bring it back to Scripture. I had a young man I met who had left his faith, and we were having lunch at a conference for an hour. I was like, I'll try to answer questions if I can. I felt like I was doing terrible. At the end, he goes, is there anything else you'd say? And I said, you were telling me about leaving the faith. Tell me about the time you came in. Tell me when you knew you were a sinner, cried out to God. He's like, well, I didn't become a Christian because I was a sinner in need of grace. I became a Christian because I was hurting and told that Jesus would make me feel better. The conversation started by him asking me, why doesn't God make himself known? Why doesn't God do miracles? Why doesn't he do supernatural stuff today? At the end, I said to him, look, your question is about what God doesn't do today. Step number 1 is repenting of your sins. You want that from God, but you're not willing to do this. I said, why don't you do that now? And he's like, because I'm afraid when I go deep, what I'll find in my heart. And I'm like, now we're talking. So I can't, it doesn't always work out that way. I'm not going to pretend like I always have these magical words. That time it did. But I'm going to listen. I'm going to say, just go back and read John and ask yourself, who's this person, Jesus? Don't give up. Keep praying and stay in faith with that person is the biggest advice that I would give. And by the way, I'm just thrilled you're having these conversations, so good for you.
Thank you, Sean.
Man, that is super good. This actually kind of falls in the same direction. I've seen it time and time again where the intellectual conversation ends up going here. The idea of suffering. And the question was texted in, if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, how can he allow immense suffering that serves no clear purpose?
This is the hardest question, period. Why? Because it's intellectual and it's personal. We felt it. There's different ways. I teach a whole class on the problem of evil. This is part of my job, so we spend so much time discussing this. But I want to just take you to one story to leave you with this. In the 1800s, there was a priest by the name of Father Damien, and he chose willingly to go become a priest at Molokai for a colony of lepers with full awareness of what could happen. For 12 years, he ministered to them, he prayed for them, he buried them, he preached to them. After 12 years, he stood in front of that colony and he said 2 words that changed everything. He walked in front of them, opened up his robe and showed the first signs of leprosy and said, "We lepers." He'd become a leper, obviously. Now, before that, did they know he cared about them? Sure. What changed on that day? He wasn't an outsider. He now understood their pain intimately and paid the greatest price he could to love them. Some of you know where this is going. Who is Jesus more like? Father Damien before he got leprosy or after? After. It's only in Christianity. You ask the question, why does God allow so much pain and suffering and hurt? Sometimes I go, I don't know the answer to that. I can't answer it. I'm not going to pretend to. But here's what I know. I know that God has not abandoned us to our pain. It's only in Christianity that God didn't just send a prophet and an angel and a book. God sent his only son to step into human race. Feel the weight of our own pain. Hebrews 4, we have a high priest who's like us in every way, yet without sin. When you're like, where's God when I hurt? The answer is he's actually right there suffering with you. Only Christianity can say that. You can't say, you don't understand, Sean, or you don't understand God because, I've been betrayed by a friend. It hurts. And Jesus is like, yeah, I've been there. You don't understand, my family betrays me. Jesus is like, yeah, they wanted to trick me to get killed in Judea. Because you don't understand the physical pain that I've been through. And Jesus says, I do. On the cross. It's only in Christianity that God steps into the muck and feels our hurt and feels our pain. I'll tell you something I haven't shared publicly ever because it happened yesterday, and maybe this is I don't know, I'll share it with you. We're walking along the trail, your beautiful, amazing trail along the lake. It's one of my favorite walks on the planet. And my wife said to me, she goes, 2 times in your life I've seen you most grow to be with the Lord. Number one, seriously, it was at my master's program at Talbot when I started to learn to defend my faith. She's like, your confidence grew. Second, a year and a half ago, some of you know this if you follow my channel, I went through 3 months of physical hell. It hurt so bad. I lost about 15 pounds and was about 135. And you know what? I prayed for God to take that away, and he didn't. And yesterday on the walk, my wife, I didn't ask her, she said, when you were in class and you went through that pain, God has used that more than anything to just change your heart and make you on fire for the Lord. I don't know why God allowed this person to suffer, but I know we serve a God who suffers and a God who also has defeated death on the cross and promises to redeem everything, where every tear in our eye will be wiped away. Why am I a Christian? Because I think Christianity, well, I can't answer all my questions. I think it answers that question better than any other faith system on the planet.
Man, that's profound. Thank you. We'll come over here.
Sean, thank you so much for being here. I'm Byron, and I have a special friend of mine, and he's from Jerusalem. He's a little bit older than me. He's been out here about 20 years, and he loves God. And I think some of the hardest things to understand with him is the disconnect between Jesus and God. And it was just an hour before coming here, he asked me, why did Jesus get the name Jesus? And he also wished, us a really good day today. And I whispered in his ear because I don't understand why he doesn't understand in Jesus, right? From Jerusalem, man of God and love. And I whispered into his ear, that Jesus loved him. And he had some questions. And the Lord finally opened the door for me to approach him more in another way. And the suffering and the things I see and his beliefs, that just breaks my heart. And I know we've talked a lot tonight about a movement of hearing about Jesus more and being more evident in our lives. And from, back in the 60s or the 70s and the difference in the disconnect between until now. And the Lord keeps allowing me to be in positions to be bold, to be more bold in my faith, but in a way that can sound more loving, a way that's not condemning, a way that's not pointing the finger. What would you say that what we could do to be that person, to take this light out there today, that it burns for people like my friend from Jerusalem that loves God?
So my suspicion is the mere fact that you're asking this question, you're like 90% plus of the way there. If you didn't have a heart for your friend, you wouldn't stand here in front of 2,000 people and ask the question in the way that you do. I would say in many ways, the heart that you're expressing is the same heart that God has for all of us and for Jerusalem. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. So what you're expressing is the heart of God. So number one, pray for your friend, obviously. Keep talking with them. I mean, you're right to do this. So many times, is this person Jewish or just from Jerusalem?
He's definitely Jewish and from Jerusalem, family there and everything right now. And
I honestly, I love Jews for Jesus. It's such a good ministry. I'm having one of their key people on soon to talk about it on my channel. I haven't talked about that a lot on my YouTube channel. I think their videos are solid, and they talk about some of the unique objections that many Jews have coming to faith. For example, one of the biggest ones is if I follow Jesus, I lose my Jewishness. That's a huge barrier. Another huge barrier sociologically, the way Christians have treated Jews. It's like I'm turning my back. The other is, for many people, if they believe in Jesus, it costs them personally. So just being aware of some of the unique objections that Jews might have, asking questions and staying in a relationship, praying with him, I think you're on the right track. Keep it up. Thank you, brother.
Thank you for coming, brother. Appreciate you.
That's great. All right, well, come over here.
My name is Elena, and my question is, how can I believe that the story or the Bible from today is still the same from like thousands of years ago?
Elaine, how old are you?
I'm 15.
15
Or
years
16.
old. 16. How did you mess that up?
I don't know. I'm really nervous.
Are you a reader, Elena?
I struggle.
You struggle.
Yeah.
Do you like shorter books?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a book in the back. It's called More Than a Carpenter. This book has been printed 30 million copies worldwide. It's a short book. You can read it in a couple, 3 hours. My father, you heard Pastor Jim mention that he was a skeptic decades ago, trying to disprove Christianity. Jesus is not God, the Bible's not true. Looked into it historically and was like, wow, there's a lot of manuscripts, early manuscripts. There's archaeological evidence for this. There's evidence outside of the Bible. If we just look at the Bible and the New Testament through the same lens that we assess other ancient books and events, we have incredible confidence that these events really took place. So my point is, if you come to the back, I'm going to sneak back there in a minute, and you just say, hey, it's Elena. I want to sign you a copy and give it to you for free, because he walks through in that book how to answer your question. Now, if you don't want the book, then that means you weren't really sincere about your question and really wanting to know. I'm saying that to challenge you, because I hope you come back and shake my hand. You can read it quickly, and that will get you started. But just keep in mind, the Bible's not myths, it's not legends. And we have the kinds of historical markers for the Bible that we look for in ancient history to know that it's really true. And the Bible stands far and above so many other ancient books in the reliability that we have for it. I'd love to give you that quick book that talks about this if you want it. Come see me in the back. Thank you.
That's great. Also, I love the gauntlet challenge of if you mean it, there's 2,000 people here. They're going to see if you go to the... and what he's referring
honestly, why did Jesus teach in parables? He was trying to weed out people who just showed up for the food. Honestly, and for the show. And some people would stay after and really ask the questions they really wanted to know. After I taught for a while, I made it harder on my students to know if they really wanted to learn. Anyways, keep going.
Super good. And there's more books out there. We'll talk more about it in a little bit out at the information area for you guys to grab. I'm going to do one text-in question from Hayden, and then we'll come over here next. This is one that's common. If God is unchanging, immutable, has been the same, why does it seem like his character shifts from the Old Testament to the New Testament and how he engages with people?
The key is how it seems. In the Old Testament, you have over and over again, like passages in Ezekiel that talk about, I do not want to destroy, I want to save and preserve. You see long suffering and patience in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, interesting when people say this, Jesus talked about hell, I'm pretty sure, more than anybody else. That's about as harsh of teaching as one is going to find. And make sure as you read through the New Testament, you make it to the book of Revelation. Because there's a lot of judging and warfare that takes place there, like we do in the Old Testament. So I think it's what seems the case, but when we probe into God's heart behind it, I don't think it's as deep. But with that said, I get why people say it seems this. And so realize we also have progressive revelation. God reveals himself and his character over time. When he calls Abraham, he hadn't given him the law. He gives Moses the law. And David comes, he gives him more. The prophets come, gives him more. And then finally, when Jesus shows up, Hebrews tells us in the past he spoke in all these different ways. Now he speaks through his son. So we see grace and truth clearly in Jesus, depicted in the most clear fashion that you might say was somewhat obscured in the Old Testament. That'd be my best shot at that one.
It's good. Your best shot is pretty good. We'll take it. We'll come right over here. Just a reminder, we got just a couple minutes left, so make sure you keep it kind of concise, and we'll try to crank through as many as we can.
My question is, how should we defend our faith as a young adult?
How should you defend your faith as a young adult?
Yes.
Great question. Number one, you got to know what faith it is that you believe. 50% of evangelicals don't even read the Bible. 50% of self-identified evangelicals don't even read the Bible. Read your Bible and be in the Word. Learn how to defend it. Again, get some apologetics books. Listen to some podcasts. Again, some of my favorite ones, William Lane Craig, Stand to Reason, Greg Koukl. Those are two musts for anybody. Follow some apologists on YouTube. Mike Winger has a great channel. Frank Turek has a great channel. But the way you defend your faith should be with graciousness and with love. One of the best ways to defend your faith is not to make statements, but to ask questions. Do you know in the Gospels and Acts, we have 340 questions recorded that Jesus asked. In the letters of Paul, 262 questions. There's 3,000 questions in the Bible. So know your stuff. Be gracious and kind with people. That's 1 Peter 3:15. And ask a lot of questions. And based on what the friend said earlier, don't give up. Keep going and keep praying for people. If you do that, I'm confident God will use you in ways you couldn't even anticipate.
Awesome. We'll come right over here.
Hi, Sean. My name is Vanessa. Nice to meet you. I actually kind of piggyback off of what you're already talking about.
Cool.
And my question really has to come around. You host all kinds on your podcast. Atheists, believers you agree with, believers you don't agree with.
Yep.
And my question is more, what is the Sean McDowell's best practices for conversational hospitality?
Oh my goodness. That's like the sweetest question I've ever been asked. You're making my day, lady. You know, first off, videos are edited. So if you saw, my point was, my wife is here. Will you wave? Stand up and wave. My beautiful wife, after 25 years, last week. The amount of times I apologize to my wife and kids, like I'm putting on my pants and making mistakes like everybody else does. But when it comes to the conversations that I host, a friend of mine who's a cold case detective, he said, you win or lose in court in jury selection before you even go to court. A lot of the success of conversations I have are choosing the right kinds of people, Christian or not, that want to engage in a fair, good faith conversation. I'll talk with almost anybody that disagrees with me if I think they're entering in a thoughtful, good faith fashion. So that's a piece of it. Second, I don't feel like I have to win every argument. Even though I'm an apologist, more than anything, I want clarity. Where do we differ and why do we differ? If I'm wrong, hopefully I have the courage and I try to shift my views. So I want to listen well. I actually want conversations to be a win-win. So I had a friend come on, his name's Brandon Robertson. He's a progressive Christian, believes that Jesus sinned. So as far as I'm concerned, he's left the theological farm. And I've told him that, and he has no problem having me say that. He came on my channel. He's been on other channels where people just try to rip him and shred him. And I think, what